Hello and welcome to the Health Bridge podcast. I'm your host, Holly B, and I welcome you back to this series that Andrea Marshall and I are doing on cognitive biases. This is something that is simply part of human nature. It is something that we all fall, quote unquote, victim to, but there's nothing necessarily innately bad or wrong with cognitive bias. And as we've discussed in previous episodes, the biases are there for a reason. They're there to actually help us through our day. Cognitive biases are not inherently good or bad, they just are. They're really a clever hack that is part of our human nature to help us manage our lives on a day-to-day basis without having to overthink every single little thing that we do or say or decide on. And we've talked more about that in previous episodes, which I will have linked in the show notes. But just to reintroduce Andrea quickly, she is a project manager and positive psychology practitioner. She's a teacher, she's an avid learner, and she is very passionate about helping people flourish and helping projects succeed. Her mission is to provide business leaders and project professionals with knowledge and skills necessary to support their own well being and the well being of others, to meaningfully engage stakeholders, and to lead thriving teams in service of improved business and project outcomes. So, today we are diving into a particular cognitive bias. We are going to be talking about confirmation bias. None of us are immune to this bias. This is a fun one to dive into. I promise you'll see yourself in probably several of these examples. The reason why we're doing these episodes is just to create more awareness of how we move throughout our lives making decisions. And if we can become aware of these biases that we have, then we can make more informed decisions as we grow. This will be a nice short episode again. Please enjoy this episode with Andrea. Andrea Marshall, welcome back to the podcast. I'm excited to continue our series on biases and how they infiltrate our daily thoughts, our daily actions, how they permeate our entire lives.
All the things, right?
All the things. Yeah. When we were first talking about doing some continued episodes, and for any of you that haven't listened to the first few, we're doing a mini series on cognitive biases. So make sure I'll link those in the show notes so you guys can go back and listen to those. They're all fascinating. I don't remember where I was going with that, Andrea.
Maybe a quick recap on why we have biases, and
That sounds perfect.
it'll kick us off. So just a quick reminder, right? Bias doesn't mean bad, right? Often we associate a bias as somehow being negative. It's not. These are neither good nor bad. We don't have all the information we need or all the time we need to necessarily navigate our world and make decisions. And our brains develop these little, some people would call them hacks maybe, or these little rules that help us make decisions quickly and easily. But it means that we do follow kind of habits and routines to be able to make decisions, navigate our lives, and go through the world. And oftentimes they're just fine. They don't get in our way. We move along. I have a bias around stopping at stoplights. Like that's something I do. It works for me. Some people I notice don't necessarily have the same bias that I have. They believe that yellow means go fast. But it's just how we go about the world and those routines and decisions we make. And so looking forward to digging into some specific biases now and how they show up for us. Today, we're doing, I believe, confirmation bias, right? Where we're going.
Yep. Let's dig in. And first off, I'm so fascinated by the amount of documented types of biases that there are. That's why I think it's such a fun idea to be doing these short little mini episodes and touching on all these, because I don't care who you are, where you live, what you believe in, we all are We all take part in these biases, and it's kind of fun to be able to ferret them out and see which ones we are more affected by than others.
Yeah, there's an estimate, depending on what source you use, somewhere between 150 and 180 various brain biases. Lots of things get lumped into that category. But yeah, so we could talk about these for many, many years and still have lots to talk about. So yeah, it'll be fun.
Tell us, what is confirmation bias? I'm sure that's something that a lot of people have heard of, but maybe don't really know the details of.
Yeah. Confirmation bias is one of the biases that we do tend to hear a lot of. We hear a lot of it in the news and in the media. And confirmation bias basically just means that we have a tendency to seek out, interpret, and favor information that confirms beliefs we already hold. And additionally, we may avoid or ignore information that disconfirms our pre-existing beliefs. And so we do have a tendency to overvalue information that agrees with us, right? Going back to one of our earlier episodes, I'm not biased, you're biased, right? We want to believe our biases and our points of view are the right ones. And for us, they may be, but it also means that when we are doing research, we have a tendency to weigh evidence that is in favor with our belief more heavily than evidence that might contradict it. And it can lead to poor decision making because it limits our ability to consider alternative viewpoints and evidence. And especially when making medical decisions and decisions for our health, this can play a really big role.
And it can be really hard to determine whether or not you're playing in confirmation bias with different things, because I'll give an example for myself. I have been very interested in nutrition for years. I've had to cut out lots of different things from my diet, such as gluten and sugar and different things, right? And as you go down the nutrition rabbit hole and get more into holistic health, there is, I mean, everything that you see everywhere goes to the anti-inflammatory diet, being plant-based, maybe even as far as vegetarian or vegan. And it's everywhere. It's pervasive in the media, and in most holistic health outlets will say the same thing. So it's hard to know if there is other information out there that might contradict that.
Mm-hmm.
And part of my healing journey has been in being in total belief of that more plant-based model, and learning that there is actually another way of looking at nutrition, learning that there is a whole nother side that is demonized in the media, which is being animal-based all the way to carnivore, which means you're basically eating primarily animal foods.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a huge mindset shift for me and a huge eye-opener, that there is actually a lot of research that supports that over plant-based for even things like lupus, which I have. So how do we, I guess, start figuring out if there is confirmation bias, if there is other information out there to begin with?
I think we start with accepting that we have confirmation bias. We all do. It is inevitable. And for your own journey, this belief that the plant-based path was the correct one, was the desirable one, confirmed what you believed. There was lots of information out there about a carnivore diet or a more omnivore type diet around, like, the research has always been there. But because you have confirmation bias, you tend to lean towards the plant-based research. You tend to weigh it more strongly. And ironically, in the world we live in, if you're doing your research online, and if you're doing lots of research on plant-based diets and anti-inflammatory diets. The omnivore and carnivore diets are never very seldom labeled as anti-inflammatory. They have sort of other words associated with them. Your search results start to trend towards what you are looking for anyway. So one of the things we know about advertising, right, is the internet is going to feed us whatever it is we're looking for in our information. And so we have to be really intentional. And I think step one is I have confirmation bias. I'm seeing all this research that absolutely confirms my belief. If I want to have a really complete understanding, I have to go out and actively seek out that information which may contradict. The information was, Atkins has been around for a very long time. The Whole30 has a lot of research behind it. There are lots of other diets out there that you could have gone down the rabbit hole about, but we have to be intentional and just recognize. And confirmation bias can get a little bit tricky when doing things like medical or nutrition or health related research, because in addition to being biased towards one aspect of nutrition, we'll stay with that example, we may also be biased around where the research is coming from. Maybe I trust these authorities more than those authorities, or I see these people as greater authorities than these other people. And so there can be layers. And we start with these sorts of conversations where we begin to ask ourselves, am I biased here? And not even am I biased, what is my bias? And do I need to think about actively seeking an alternative opinion to weigh my current known facts against?
And that's really an uncomfortable place to go, especially when we're talking about something as personal as our health. Mm-hmm. That's one thing if we're talking about politics or if we're talking about, some things that don't make that huge of a difference in our life. But if we're going through a health experience and we have very strong personal opinions, maybe on the type of medicine that we believe in. Maybe it's Western medicine and all holistic is a sham, or maybe it's the opposite. Holistic is the only way to go. Western medicine is going to poison me. I think that it's incredibly important, whichever side you're on, or maybe you're in the middle and you need more clarity. It's really important to challenge your own beliefs. And, even just a few years ago, that would have been hard for me to admit that there could be other things out there. There could be some great benefit to Western medicine, for example. And here I am now doing mostly holistic. However, I am on a medication to help with keeping my lupus in remission. So I think it's important to seek out practitioners that are open-minded or will at least entertain conversations with you about both sides. For example, I have a dermatologist who, and I'll be honest, I tend to not put a whole lot of faith in dermatology just in general. However, there are great dermatologists out there, and I happen to have found one that is totally willing to engage in conversations with me about possibilities that don't include just pills and medications and creams. Mm-hmm. So, that's really important. And because she's open to that, I'm much more open to listening to what she says. And so I think being able to have this open-minded sense about it, being willing to challenge our own beliefs and step out of the comfort zone of our beliefs is super important and will get you so much further in the long run. So maybe it's stepping into these topics and saying, I have a really strong belief that plant-based is the way to go, or that carnivore is the only way to heal. Maybe I should, or where can I look for alternate information so that I can prove to myself that I'm right or find another possibility out there. Really quick, Holly B here. I just wanted to interrupt the podcast to ask you for a quick favor. Can you take just a moment to like and subscribe to this podcast on whatever platform you are listening in on? It makes a world of a difference. And the reach of this podcast, it takes like literally under 10 seconds. So go do that right now. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And now back to the episode.
Yeah. Understand the science behind both to arrive at my own decision. My very favorite medical professionals are the ones who are willing to engage in those conversations. So often we have a professional who maybe we've known for a long time, or we like them, we like their demeanor and the way they show up, and they have like high confidence and they make us feel confident. But when we start to broach a subject, they're dismissive or, oh no, that's not right. Rather than a conversation like, well, that's interesting, let's talk about that. Or even, wow, that's a perspective I'm not as familiar with, let's learn.
Yes.
And I think those sorts of things, we're seeing some definite shifts in some areas of the medical profession where those explorations are starting to happen and people are becoming more comfortable. I think one of the challenges with confirmation bias, particularly in regards to healthcare, is our confirmation biases can become strongest if we're under a high cognitive load. So when there's a lot weighing on our mind, when things are heavy, we can dig in. And the other thing that affects that is high emotion. When we have perhaps a new diagnosis, or we have a diagnosis that things are getting worse, and we're in this state of stress and fear and anguish and worry and all of those things, there is a real tendency to dig in or to faithfully follow those we believe in. And that can be a real difficult place to try to interject a little bit of like, hey, let's look at something new. It's easy to look at something new when there's nothing weighing on your mind. And it becomes a lot harder when the stakes are high. But it is often when the stakes are high that we most need to adopt that open, curious mindset of what are all the options and the pros and cons of all the options. And yes, let's follow a path to resolve immediate issues, but let's question along the way.
Yeah. And also, when someone is in the midst of a health crisis, they might not always be able to make decisions for themselves at that time. And then they're relying on family members and doctors to be the authorities and the decision maker. And that can be difficult too, because you might have, as the patient, strong beliefs, but you're not in a position to be able to communicate that. So that is also a challenge. I don't know if that's necessarily here nor there with this exact conversation, but just another level of that story and that experience.
It can. And at those times, especially when you have lots of other people around you who might be making decisions for you or trying to influence you, they are all coming with their own confirmation biases. And so having open, vulnerable, honest relationships with the people that you surround yourself with, friends and family and trusted advisors, before that you have to make those hard decisions. Not always, we never plan for that, right? We don't plan to have an illness. We don't, the only time we plan for those sorts of things is as we age, right? And everybody's like, oh, you want to get all of your paperwork in place as you age because we know what's coming. But we don't do that as young people. Like, oh, let me have this difficult conversation with my parents in the unlikely event that something critical happens with my help and I am reliant on them and needing them.
And even vice versa, having that conversation with our parents should and when something happens to them,
Mhm.
being aware of what their preferences are is also
Yeah.
just as important, right?
Yeah.
Another aspect I think of this too is when you are given a diagnosis, you may already have preconceived notions what that illness is going to look like in your life and how it's going to play out based on, for example, my mom also has lupus. So I might therefore assume that my lupus experience is going to be just like hers. When in fact, especially with lupus, we know that everybody is an individual case.
Mhm.
Everybody experiences it a little bit differently than the next person. So, can you speak to that a little bit more on, how we expect to move through our health experiences?
I think it's not just our health experiences. I think it's in lots of
True. True.
areas. So you're touching on another area that we're going to be speaking about in depth, which is that anecdotal fallacy and this sort of idea that, that we have this one anecdote about how a thing is, and we generalize it to be across the board that this is how it will always be. We often see this with those who don't have health issues or don't have, particular, we see it a lot with like handicaps and various things. If I have one friend who has lupus, right, and I know that's what they're like and how to be with that friend, and then I learn somebody else has lupus, I automatically assume that I need to treat them in the same way that I do my friend, when in fact they may have a completely different set of symptoms and a completely different set of needs and a completely different set of things. But we don't think to ask. We're like, oh, I know about lupus. I, I know this one person. And when in fact you are an experiment of one. And that almost circles back to the healthcare journey, right? We are each an experiment of one. Our biology is so similar and yet so different that determining what works for us under a certain set of circumstances may be very different. But it can lead to, oh, I've had this experience with this person. I knew somebody in high school. I knew somebody in college. I knew somebody at a workplace. I had this person. This is what their experience was like with this. And so we then sort of broad base make assumptions of here's now how I need to act with them. Here's how they're feeling or how what they're experiencing in their body with their day to day energy, when in fact that could be very incorrect. And for ourselves and for others, it's a good reminder to stop and check in. How am I? How are you? Not how are you? Oh, I'm fine, kind of the social contract that we have. But truly, how are you today? Now, is this something you're wanting to do? What can I do? How do I need to know? What do I need to know? All good questions.
Yeah, so really becoming aware of these things is not making assumptions on so many different levels.
Yeah.
I was just speaking to a friend yesterday about Don Miguel Ruiz's book, The Four Agreements. One of those agreements is about not making assumptions. 'Cause we don't know. Really, I don't know what's going on specifically in your head right now. I don't know what your experience, Andrea, is exactly of this conversation, how you're interpreting it, potentially different than I am. And that carries into every aspect of life, really. So if we're talking about our health, well, let's not make assumptions. Let's not have confirmation bias that because I have this labeled diagnosis, I'm going to have this life experience,
Mhm.
you know, because I'm taking this one medicine, let's not assume that I'm going to have these side effects or, have this healing journey. we can take that into relationships. We can take that into jobs, like I said, every single aspect of life.
We can take it into so I have a regular yoga practice. Like every day I get to show up to yoga brand new because my body doesn't do today what it did yesterday. Will that be what it does tomorrow? The older I get, the more obvious that becomes.
Boy, I'm feeling that too.
So yeah, and just giving ourselves a little bit of grace to be present with ourselves and let go of some of those beliefs and assumptions that we have and willing to question them. Well, where does that come from? And am I making an assumption about this? That sort of, we may get a diagnosis and feel like, oh no, I'll never be able to travel again. I'll have to stay close to my medical team, to the people I know. But that's like, really? Never? maybe not right now. That may be true for a while, but watching out for those always, and never are really great words to look for in seeing where some of those biases might crop up and where we're finding resistance in our own self to new information. We often read something or hear something and our immediate response can be, that's not true. And there's almost this physical sort of wall we feel going up. Those can be clues for us as we become more self-aware to say, gosh, why am I resisting this information? And what happens if I explore that a little more deeply? Doesn't mean I have to accept it, but to certainly listen and consider it. Those are two different things.
I do the shutdown response with politics a lot. So yes, I see myself again getting called out in so many of these biases that we talked about and are continuing to talk about. And so again, that's why we're doing this series, because we all need to be called out a little bit, because that's how we grow. That's how we shift. That's how we change our mindset. That's how we become more accepting. That's how we open our perspectives to things. So Andrea, anything left to discuss on confirmation bias?
Confirmation bias, I think we've covered the full spectrum on confirmation bias. Yeah, that reminder that we do all have it. And that doesn't mean it's wrong, just an awareness of it. And then ways that we can reduce our own confirmation biases, right? Or start to expand our mindset and our viewpoints is recognizing that it exists and what it is, and then actively seeking out alternative information, opinions that challenge our own beliefs. It doesn't mean we have to let go of our own beliefs, but it's good to hold them up to the mirror from time to time and see if they still fit. And then again, being aware of the assumptions. Often we do feel it in our body when we encounter information that contradicts. So that's a great sort of check to see, hey, is this something that maybe I'm willing to explore more?
Perfect. We'll leave off the series right here, and we'll pick this up again next time with another cognitive bias that I'm sure you all will be able to relate to as well. So, Andrea, thank you so much, and we'll see you again soon.
Sounds good. Thanks, Holly.
So, if you found yourself in any of the examples of confirmation bias that we went over, raise your hand. I know you're all raising your hands. I know, because we are not immune to these things, right? It again is just part of the human experience. So I would love it if you would reach out to Andrea and I and give us one example of confirmation bias that you recognized in your own life. And now that you are aware of it, how you may or may not go about things differently. I'm excited to continue this series with Andrea. If you have any questions about anything that we have talked about here, reach out to myself, reach out to Andrea. We would love to chat with you more about this. Thank you so much for listening, and stay tuned for more episodes in this cognitive bias series coming up over the next few months.